Doomscrolling, disaster pornography, and media logics. Coined in the late 2010s and formalized into pop culture and social media vocabulary during the COVID-19 pandemic, the term doomscrolling describes the compulsion to consume negative or catastrophic news online, the drive to habitually inundate oneself with negative, violent, or traumatic content long past the point of cognitive saturation. Research in communication and psychology confirms that doomscrolling exacerbates anxiety and depression, fueling depression and hopelessness as individuals scroll through repetitive, distressing narratives algorithmically designed to be addictive. But doomscrolling isn't just a personal habit, and it's nothing new. What we call doomscrolling extends from an older tradition of how modern media have always handled disaster content. Defined as context-lacking, repetitive visual representations of human suffering and misfortune, the term disaster pornography, coined by Timothy Rickuber in 2013, has been employed to describe everything from apocalyptic blockbuster Hollywood productions like the movie 2012 and Armageddon, to the media's coverage of real-world scenarios like 9/11 and Haiti. More recently, John Doyle in 2017 parodied Rickuber's earlier definition of disaster porn, stating, "The temptation to indulge in endless coverage of destruction allows what has become known as weather porn to evolve into disaster porn, and the effect, as with all forms of pornography, is numbing." Viewers become desensitized and instinctively long for more dramatic, horrific footage. Perspective is lost, and talk and discussion seems redundant as images dominate. These representations aren't simply informational. They become a kind of spectacle, consumed for emotional impact as much as for civic knowledge. And spectacle is the key word here. The French theorist Guy Debord, in his 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, argued that modern life is increasingly mediated by images, and that social relationships themselves become mediated by appearances. As Debord put it, the spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. Disaster pornography and doomscrolling are continuations of this spectacle society. Catastrophes don't just happen, and they are not simply spoken about. They must be seen, shared, and replayed again and again so that the consumption of catastrophe becomes a cultural norm. But the consequences of such consumption aren't limited to anxiety, depression, or numbness. In the early 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted his famous Bobo doll experiments, demonstrating that children who observed adults behaving aggressively toward a toy were more likely to imitate that aggression themselves. We call this social learning theory, and it helps us to understand that media, like people, provide models for behavior. Media audiences learn and reproduce what they see on their screens. In the 1970s, communication scholar George Gerbner extended this knowledge with what we call cultivation theory. Instead of focusing on immediate imitation, as Bandura did, Gerbner examined the long-term effects of media consumption. His Cultural Indicators project found that heavy television viewing cultivated a worldview in which people perceived the world as far more dangerous than it really was, a phenomenon known as the mean world syndrome. This helps explain why decades of crime-saturated news media caused viewers to develop deeply ingrained feelings of paranoia and unrealistic fears of being victimized, even as actual crime rates fluctuated. At the same time, researchers like Maxwell Combs and Donald Shaw were developing agenda-setting theory, a concept explaining that media don't necessarily tell us exactly what to think, but they are remarkably effective at telling us what to think about. Later extensions of agenda-setting theory, such as framing theory, explain how the media's grammar, that is, the norms and expectations of how stories are packaged, shapes the way viewers interpret issues. For example, crime Crimes can be framed as isolated tragedies, systemic failures, or ongoing social moral deprivation. This, of course, has serious consequences for public opinion and policy. By the 1980s and 90s, television news had thoroughly absorbed violence as part of its formal grammar. If it bleeds, it leads wasn't just a cliche, it was programming logic. News became organized around violent crime and disaster, featuring more instances of visual spectacle and far less depth of analysis. Media critics at the time began to warn of compassion fatigue, the consequence of audiences becoming desensitized to suffering because of never-ending exposure to mediated cycles of violence and catastrophe. And in today's always-on media landscape, compassion fatigue, mean world syndrome, and other negative media effects are intensified as we all have access to a 24/7 self-updating feed of disasters that must be consumed. Sometimes we feel we can't pull our eyes away from the screen, even when the content leaves us exhausted and numb. So where does this leave us? Doomscrolling and disaster pornography are not isolated quirks of the digital age. They are the contemporary expression of long-standing media logics. The difference today is scale, speed, and intimacy. Social media like Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok collapse the distance between global catastrophe and the individual. The result is a media environment where we consume violence not just as news or entertainment. Rather, we seek or passively accept the aesthetic itself out of habit, scrolling endlessly, pulled into the swarm of images by algorithms, even when we know it leaves us drained. Researchers investigate these phenomena by applying critical and theoretical frameworks to specific media artifacts. Take, for example, a local television news broadcast that regularly leads with violent crime footage. Using cultivation theory, we can ask how repeated exposure to such coverage might reinforce the mean world syndrome, shaping viewers' perceptions of their city as unsafe, regardless of what actual crime statistics indicate. From a framing perspective, we can analyze how the news package constructs meaning. Does it treat the event as a one-off, as evidence of ongoing community decline, or as a consequence of systemic inequality? Although less direct, we can also apply these theories to our own social media experiences. How often is something violent, catastrophic, or traumatic the first thing you see when you open your social media? Or how long does it take for a given session to turn negative? Once it turns negative, how likely is it to stay that way? Is one platform more or less problematic? And of course, we can ask similar questions about artificial intelligence platforms as they develop. The consequences are real. We all face compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, and a world where violence and catastrophe become normalized as background noise. Understanding these dynamics isn't just academic, but exploring and uncovering them through academic work can equip us to better recognize and resist them. Thanks for listening.